Well, I'm super, super grateful that you're here for this benefit lecture on the date of the Last Supper. And this lecture, it's the first time that I will give it in English. I've actually given the lecture pieces of it in German before, but I've not given the lecture before in English. And I think it will take about an hour and a half. So I hope you're comfortable. Hope you're ready to stay with us for approximately 85 minutes from now. Great. And first, let me ask, did you all get the handouts? I have two handouts that I sent in an email prior. It looks like I'm seeing some head nods. Did everybody get those? Great. Okay, great. And actually, if somebody wants to spontaneously grab the URLs for those handouts and simply put them in the chat, I should have thought to do that. I didn't. But if somebody could do that for everybody, that might help out a few people here. That would be very helpful. All right, let's dive in. Well, actually, I'm going to tell you a story first of all. Why am I excited to give you this lecture on the date of the Last Supper? This became the study of Jesus' resurrection became a passion point. Thank you so much, Pam, for putting those up. The study of the resurrection of Jesus became a point of passion for me during my 11 years or so that I was working at Moody Bible Institute. And I used to have the pleasure of working with beginning and intermediate Greek students. And during the year of intermediate Greek studies, we would usually read through the resurrection accounts. So every year I was reading through these resurrection accounts in Greek, and the point of the exercise was comparative. We wanted to compare what Matthew said and how it might be different or might be the same as what Mark said, and so on. So it was a comparative study, and that was the first point where this became of an intense interest for me. And then, interestingly enough, during COVID, it was April of 2021. Tests for COVID were just becoming available to people. We were scheduled for an international move, and I became diagnosed with COVID. And I'm an asthmatic. We didn't realize at that time that COVID actually, for many of us, simply was a bad cold. Of course, there has been real tragedy, but many people came through COVID infections, praise God, in a pretty good way. But I didn't know what this course of COVID was going to be in my system. So, with a lot of gloominess in our house, we practiced self-isolation. We'd never done this self-quarantining. So I went to my room, and my wife would bring food and place it at the beginning, at the front of the door, and I would take food, and I was living off in these secluded area. And I came to read the Gospels obsessively for a few days and to pick up that passion project that I had started to do with the Moody students when we would read through Greek together. And I read the account of Jesus last week obsessively for a few days. And that was another touch point. Now, actually, just last year, when I was on a family vacation, that obsession returned to me. So this obsession has come iteratively to me in my life. But what I want to share with you is some of the fruits of that personal study. It's been a hobby, but I think you'll benefit and enjoy um, as I share some of the things that I've learned about these gospel narratives. So this is the date of the Last Supper. Here's what I'd like to note, first of all, is that um, the Gospels, here we have Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John, all put out for us in graphic form. And the first thing that I'd like to note is that this is really important, the question of when did Jesus celebrate the Last Supper? Because the last week of Jesus' life is a huge chunk of each of the four Gospels. So here you can see, for example, Matthew, and you've got the whole pie diagram representing the whole of Matthew, but 34 and almost 35% of the whole text of Matthew is given over to the last 7 days of Jesus' life, the Passion Week, we call it. Now, Luke is a little bit less. Luke is a little bit less there, 23%. Almost a quarter of Luke is given over to the last 7 days of Jesus' life. Mark and John are both quite high. Nearly 40% of these Gospels are given over to 7 days of Jesus' life, and we can call that the Passion Week. Now, the reason why I think it's really important for us to take 90 minutes on a Thursday morning for most of you and investigate this is because if the Gospels give us conflicting data on when Jesus celebrated the Last Supper, that's a big problem. That's a big problem for our understanding of what happened in this big chunk of the end of the Gospels. So I'm a historian by background, but I'm really interested to see um, if we can synchronize what the Gospels are telling us about the date of the celebration of the Last Supper. And of course, I wouldn't have prepared this lecture if I thought it was an impossible problem. However, I do, before we get into the dive into the biblical study and unraveling the problem, I really want us to face what the problem is head on. Otherwise, if we don't understand what the problem is, we're not going to be able to make it very far into the untangling of the problem. Here's the problem at base, and I'll open the scriptures in just a minute. We'll look at some specific texts in the New Testament and see where that discrepancy lies. But just to get our minds around the question, the question is whether Jesus was crucified on Nisan the 14th or Nisan the 15th. And I first of all want to note that this has been a long-standing problem for biblical scholarship. Okay, so F.F. Bruce, whom if you track with evangelical scholarship, you probably will know his name. F.F. Bruce is a renowned conservative biblical scholar. I think he hailed from England. I better not say where because I'm not quite sure. But he called this question of the date of the Last Supper the thorniest problem in the New Testament. Oh, great. If you're trying to study out the so-called contradictions in the New Testament or places where there's friction between the gospel record, this is the worst of them all. This is the thorniest problem, the most difficult problem in the New Testament, says scholar F.F. Bruce. John P. Meyer, a Roman Catholic who worked for many decades at Notre Dame in Indiana, concurs. He says the Synoptics and John are in direct disagreement over the nature of the Last Supper as a Passover meal and over the date, of Jesus' death. Now, for those Roman Catholics with us today, there is a higher yet authority than John P. Meyer. That's Benedict XVI himself, claims that there is a resolution to this, but John P. Meyer was no slouch. He was a brilliant, very hardworking, and largely conservative scholar, and he sees this as a real problem. Okay. Also, I'm an early church historian. I find it fascinating that this discrepancy can possibly be even traced to the early church. Eusebius, the church historian who was working in the 4th century, right around the time of the transition to Constantine and the so-called Constantinian revolution in the early 4th century, he records a controversy that was raging in the early church in the 2nd century called the Quartodecimian controversy. Now, that's a strange name. Quartodecimian comes from the Latin word for 14th. I suppose we could paraphrase this, the 14thers controversy or something. Quartodecimian means 14 in Latin. And the Quartodecimians were a group within the early church. Incidentally, they hailed almost exclusively from Asia Minor, from the place where John the Apostle had ministered and died. And this group, with ties to that apostolic generation, with a living memory of John's own delivery of this tradition, they claimed that Jesus was crucified on the 14th of Nisan, and that affected the way that Easter ought to be celebrated. Okay, it's a little more complicated than that. It's not worth our time to dig in, but you can see one possible reading of this 2nd century controversy is over the question of the date of the Last Supper. You can tie it to that. All right. Now let's dive into the gospel accounts themselves. I want you to see this really, really clearly. What is this problem we're trying to solve? Before we can get there, we have to understand what we're trying to solve. And let's look at it as clearly as we can in the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic Gospels, of course, that means Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So here's the problem in its most basic form. According to Luke, but also Matthew and Mark, Jesus, when he celebrated the Last Supper, he was celebrating the Passover. Jesus says that very clearly in Luke 22:15. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover. I provide the Greek there, ta pascha, with you before I suffer. Okay. So there shouldn't really be any question at this point. According to Luke, what is the Last Supper? The Last Supper is a Passover. Jesus calls it a Passover here unambiguously. The other synoptic gospels concur. And just for variety's sake, could one of you, in a clear voice, I've got lots of scripture we'll have to work through and we get to work through together. Would one of you simply read this text for me? That'd be really helpful. Don't be bashful, just somebody unmute and read.
Luke 22:15. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Mark 14:12-16. And on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? And he sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. And wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. There prepare for us. And the disciples set out and went to the city and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. Amen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So once again here in Mark, really there shouldn't be any question. About 4 times that in the text, we are clearly told that the Last Supper that Jesus is preparing for here is the Passover. Now, sometimes we have Passover lamb is the English translation for the same Greek term, ta pascha, and sometimes we have eat the Passover. I suppose you mean the Passover dinner. It's the same word that can create some confusion, and we'll get into that in just a moment too. But it's not really it's not up for discussion here whether this Last Supper that Jesus is preparing for is going to be the Passover. What's the alternative if this isn't the Passover? Is this a some sort of special meal or special dinner? No, this is not just any other dinner. This is obviously the Passover. Now hold tight with me. We're going to go through about 5 more minutes of scriptures just so we can see this discrepancy in it absolutely clearly. Actually, I've taken out every single scripture that I have been able to find that gives evidence to this problem and placed it out here. So I've got like 6 more texts. Could we have another volunteer read Matthew 26:17-19, please?
Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, where will you have us prepare for you to eat the Passover? He said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover.
Thank you so much, Sister Anne Marie. So Matthew's text here is essentially following the same as Mark. It's not quite as detailed as Mark's text was, but it's the same tradition. Jesus is telling his disciples to prepare for Passover, and it twice clearly affirmed we're speaking of the Passover here. Great. Now Luke has one more text, confirms the same point, but just for thoroughness' sake, if somebody would also read that.
Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat it.
Great. So again, just the heading there's the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are completely clear that the Last Supper is celebrated as a Passover meal. Now, not only do we have those specific references that I've teased out there or placed on the board, not only are those statements very clear that this is a Passover meal, but a very hardworking and brilliant German scholar in this case, Joachim Jeremias, wrote a book which is translated into English as the Eucharistic Words of Jesus. It's a very useful, very good little book. And Jeremias analyzed the Eucharistic narratives and found many, many other small elements in the text which would align perfectly with this being the celebration of the Passover. For example, the breaking and the blessing of the bread that we read about in the Synoptic Gospels. That's in complete alignment with this being a Passover meal. It's not any other form of dinner. Or in Luke, as we read Jesus instituting the Eucharist, we read that Jesus blesses the cup, and then Jesus blesses the bread, and then Jesus blesses the cup. Again, what's going on? Well, in the context of a Passover meal, that would make sense. There are 4 cups in a Passover meal. The dipping of the bread in a bowl, which Jesus conducts with Judas Iscariot. Even the foot washing before the meal, Jeremias can read clearly as elements of a Passover meal. So it's not just those biblical texts, but it's also the whole structure of the dinner as it plays out in the Synoptic Gospels that we can see this is clearly a Passover meal. Now, it seems like there should be no problem at all. The problem is that John clearly tells us that this is not a Passover meal, or more specifically, John says that Jesus was crucified and died on the afternoon prior to the celebration of the Passover meal. And that's what creates the problem. And John, or potentially, and John is even stronger on his language. So some interpreters, when they come to this, the difficulty between John and the Synoptic Gospels, they will side with John and reread the Synoptic Gospels. And there's a little bit more wiggle room to do that. I think that's not a very useful solution. I don't find that very satisfying. I think you have to really strain the texts terribly to make them do that. But John is even more clear that Jesus dies prior to the Passover meal. And if Jesus dies before the Passover, then of course the Last Supper cannot be a Passover meal because the Passover hasn't happened yet. So let's look at John. And again, if I've got about 4 texts here, but I'd be grateful if we could have readers spontaneously read these texts. Please go ahead.
Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters, so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover.
Great. So during the trial of Jesus, John tells us that the religious leaders here do such and such because they're yet planning to eat the Passover. That's not yet happened. The Passover has not yet happened. And if I can have another reader for John 18:39, please.
But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?
Great. And this is Pilate speaking. Pilate's plan is, hey, we're going to release somebody because that's always the custom at Passover. But in John's account, Passover has not yet happened. It's about to happen. 19:14, please.
Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king."
So you can see the problem on full display. Here, the Passover has not yet happened, as Pilate is saying, "Behold your king." We're yet anticipating Passover. And let me see. Sorry, I've got that blocked over. There you go. If one of you can read John 19:31, please.
Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away.
Great. Yep, you can put this together. I've got one more text then for you, and then I think we're done with our survey here. This should be the last. Actually, I'll just read this. This is now the last verses here we were reading are from John 18. That's the trial of Jesus. John 19. That's the crucifixion and the condemnation and crucifixion of Jesus. This text from John comes a little bit before, and that's the beginning of the Last Supper discourse. And John tells us here, John does not give us the institution of the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is not celebrated, or at least not specifically described in John, but we have the Last Supper discourse. And John tells us that this Last Supper is not the Passover. Okay, John 13, 1-2 says, now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them. During supper, ... and so on goes the narrative. So those are all the texts where you can see clearly for the Synoptics, this Last Supper is clearly a Passover meal. For John, the Passover happens later. Now, C.K. Barrett, he wrote a nice commentary, a great commentary in the mid-last century, an English scholar, and he came up with a solution that most people have been willing to accept, but it's decidedly a compromise position, at least a compromise historically. His position was that the Synoptic Gospels have it right historically, that Jesus celebrated the Passover as the Last Supper. That means that on the night after eating the Passover, Jesus' trial begins. He's arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and so on. That means that Jesus is crucified on the Friday after the celebration of the Passover, which on that year, on 30 AD or so, must have been a Thursday. Barrett continues and says, but John, what do we do with John's account, which says that Jesus was crucified prior to the Passover, and that they had to quickly break the legs of the criminals on either side of Jesus so that they would die before the Passover? It was not necessary in Jesus' case. None of his bones were broken. C.K. Barrett concludes that John changed the chronology in order to make the theological picture that just at the time when Jesus was dying on the cross, that was the exact time that the Passover lambs were being slain in the temple. And so Barrett concludes maybe John changed the chronology in order to emphasize the theological picture of Jesus as our Passover lamb. Now, I don't think that's perfectly satisfying, but for many decades, this was the compromise position that many people sort of fudged into. Here's the way that Barrett explains it. He says, as early as Paul, in 1 Corinthians 5:7, Jesus was thought of as the true paschal sacrifice. John repeats and emphasizes this theme, and we looked at some of those texts just now. See the notes on this passage from his commentary. On his dating, Jesus died, that is, according to the dating of John, according to the Johannine chronology, Jesus died on the cross at the moment when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. This may not be good history, but it does seem to be Johannine theology. That was the position that a lot of people landed on, and what we thought for many years was the best we could do to make sense of that. However, I'm here to tell you this Easter that there is another way to read this, and let's dive into it. I'm excited because I think it emphasizes that the gospel records are historically correct on this point, and that excites me because that means that I have just a little bit more historical evidence that the resurrection is probably correct too. Of course, it's correct too, but you can make a stronger historical argument for the resurrection as well, having reduced this difficulty in the text. So I think it points to a yet stronger historical argument for the resurrection, which gives me a lot of joy. Here's what I think was happening, folks. Here's the proposal that I'm going to, now that we've laid out the problem, here's the solution that I'm going to argue for. And if I don't make it, if you don't think this is convincing, you tell me at the end. I'm happy to discuss this with you. Here's what I think happened, and I'll give some sources of how I constructed this in a moment. The proposal of this lecture is that Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples as the Last Supper on Wednesday evening, according to an alternative calendar. That is that Jesus was celebrating Passover, but 2 days earlier than the Jews celebrated the Passover. Oh my. Whether this alternative calendar can be demonstrated to have been the calendar of the Essenes is not yet clear. The Pharisees and the majority of the Jewish people celebrated the Passover on Friday evening. Okay, that's the proposal that I'm going to dive into and try to argue for. And there's a lot of pieces to it, and you can tell me at each juncture whether you think that it works or not. Hey, I want to give honor where honor is due. So this theory is relatively new, but in biblical studies, it still has a decades-long history. The French biblical scholar who first proposed this, her name was Annie Joubert, and she put this together in a book published in 1957. She became sort of obsessed with the idea too, and over a period of time worked out her theories. She taught, a Roman Catholic biblical scholar, she taught at the uh, Biblicum, I think, in Jerusalem for a number of years. She put her theories together in La Date de la Seine, and that was published into English too as The Date of the Last Supper. The theory didn't quite work. There were still some pieces to it that seemed largely dissatisfactory. Specifically, she couldn't figure out she couldn't demonstrate that the Essene calendar was what had motivated Jesus to move the celebration of the Last Supper 2 days earlier. Effectively, the argument has not come any further since her work. Although what was unsatisfactory in her thesis still has not been fixed, we can solve the biblical problems. The apparent discrepancies in the biblical text, in fact, do resolve really beautifully if you move the Last Supper to Wednesday instead of Thursday. And that's what I'll show you all in a moment. But what Annie Joubert could not demonstrate is why Jesus would have done that. And effectively, the argument has not really come any further. So I'm just going to say that Annie Joubert gets the credit for this theory. It's effectively still her own theory. A lot of us have turned our heads, though, and started noticing this because none other than Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, adopted this theory. And Benedict XVI, of course, was a magnificent scholar of the Gospels. He published the 3-volume work, Jesus of Nazareth. The piece that he discusses, where he discusses this, the date of the Last Supper, that's in volume 2. For English speakers, that's published out of Ignatius in 2011. So none other than Pope Benedict XVI picked this theory up too. I found most accessible and most helpful for me was this book, which you can see me holding up if you still have my camera view. There was a German Dominican, I think he was a Dominican, I believe so, German Dominican archaeologist who spent a quarter of a century digging the Essene area of Jerusalem, Old Jerusalem, out. That was the part right outside the Zion Gate, very close to Dormition Abbey, where there is a Dominican community today. I'm misspeaking. Actually, I fear that Dormition Abbey is Benedictine. Forgive me, I'll have to get my lines straightened out. Anyway, he was a Roman Catholic archaeologist working for many years there. He put out this very accessible book, With Jesus in Jerusalem, and he spells out and works through these theories in a very clear way, adds a lot of color to the discussion. And a lot of what I'm presenting is also dependent on him. Colin Humphreys, a Cambridge scientist, put this largely the same theory together in a 2011 book called The Mystery of the Last Supper, Reconstructing the Final Days of Jesus. It's again, pieces of the presentation have come from his work as well. I. Howard Marshall and Harold Honer both put together pieces sort of outlining the problem. And back in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, when these two evangelical scholars were working, Marshall and Honer, there was not really solutions to this problem. Annie Joubert's work had not really trickled into English-speaking scholarship, I don't think, at that point. But at least they outlined the problem in a very accessible way. And so I put them on the bibliography as well, too. All right. Let me introduce now. I've given to you some handouts, and we really need to pour over these handouts just for a minute. I want to quickly look at both of them. So my recommendation was that you might even have the luxury of having a printout next to you. That would be great. I'm going to, if you do happen to have them there, doesn't matter. I am going to use an electronic copy, so you will be able to follow here too. Won't be a problem, but if you have a paper copy, that should be really helpful. Okay. So we got the Passion Week and we've got the Passover Week. Sorry about the similar naming, but I think we'll find our way through. I'm going to come back to this chart in a moment, but the first thing that I want to do is make the proposed solution that I'm arguing for clear. And this calendar that I put up here follows the theory that I'll be presenting in this lecture. So what I've done here, and this is the fruit of all those great days when I was suffering from COVID and couldn't leave my room. I shouldn't say that too loudly, lest God give me COVID again. But what I did was read through the Gospels iteratively and try to make, according to our Western reckoning of time, so a 7-day week with our English names for the days of the week, according to a solar calendar, because of course our days in the West begin at midnight and rotate through to midnight again. So looking at time from my modern perspective, trying to make sense of the gospel narratives. And here's what I believe does work. I stand with the chronology that I've placed in this chart. And here you can see that I have Jesus celebrating the Last Supper with his disciples on Wednesday at sunset and following. So what I'm arguing for is that Jesus, traditionally, I should say, Jesus celebrated Last Supper as a Passover on Thursday. So this theory, again, borrowing from Annie Joubert, puts this celebration 1 day earlier. And then following John's chronology, we have the Passover that the Jews celebrated, the Pharisees, their calendar, and everybody else would have celebrated Passover on Friday. Now, how do we know that Jesus died on a Friday? Well, we know that because we certainly know that Jesus was raised on a Sunday. And so counting back, you place Passover on this Friday, which means that I'm going to already beg to differ with C.K. Barrett. You remember that English scholar I just introduced who said that probably John gave a historically inaccurate accounting of the Last Supper in order to emphasize that Jesus was being crucified at the precise moment that the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. I think we can say that was history. That's not inaccurate history. That's actual history. Now, it makes a beautiful theological symbol at the same time. Jesus is the Passover lamb. But that's actually historically what was taking place. Jesus actually is expiring on the cross as the Passover lambs are being slain in the temple. Josephus tells us in his Antiquities that the Passover lambs would be slain in the temple in Jerusalem between approximately 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. That's because everybody's getting ready for the celebration of the Last Supper, or the Passover, which takes place after sunset. Okay, so now you can see how the theory works, and this is meant for self-study as well. I'm going to touch on elements of this too, but we're not going to get into all the details. But I'm floored because I think all of the gospel accounts on all of the resurrection actually work. So I think that's magnificent. I put footnotes there to show you where the scripture texts are, where there's a question of interpretation or where it's not obvious how I would have come to the conclusion. I write an explanatory note, hopefully so that this is perfectly transparent. You don't have to agree with it, but you shouldn't have any confusion on how this theory is supposed to work. Okay, now we're going to get back to that, but I want to move to the second handout now, and that is the Passover week, because we have to understand how Passover works before we can understand how the Last Supper works. And even before that, we have to get to an understanding of Jewish time. Now, some of you, let's see, I think this slide is right here. Here we go. Some of you know how Jews reckoned time in antiquity. But I want to talk this through very quickly with you. Let's do this in a dialogical form. Some of you already know this information. We'll do it real quick, but I'd love to hear from you. How did the Jews tell time in antiquity? Well, the Jews used a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar? Somebody just very quickly explain to me what that means. Did you already know that? What does a lunar calendar refer to, please? Somebody, it's a simple question, I know, but is
Yeah.
somebody willing to take it?
They use the cycle of the moon, the new moon, how the moon changes to the full moon, that the way the moon
Great.
changes. I don't know how else to explain it.
Thank you so much.
The moon is the source of the calendar.
Thank you so much. They didn't have a 365 calendar year. They had a cycle of months. And of course, the cycle of months, moons, excuse me, that's going to push the yearly calendar forward by about a half month every year. So what they would do is every couple years insert an extra month back into the calendar. So their understanding of the year was fairly fluid compared to our 365 and a quarter day understanding of how a calendar year works, right? And the reason why ancient peoples would do that is because it's what's countable. Of course, mechanical watches don't exist at that time. How are you supposed to tell the time? Well, what people have access to is the rising, the waxing and waning of the moons. So with the new moon, you have the start of the new month. With the conclusion, the final waning of the moon, you have the end of the month, and that's how people kept time. Here we go. Jews reckoned the day as beginning at the evening and ending at sunset. You probably already knew this too. Have you recently looked over the days of creation? We have evening and we have morning, the first day. That's not just a poetic expression, it's how they understood time, because evening is the beginning of the day. Okay. I was curious why this would be the case. Why would they begin the day at sunset? Can anybody help me think that through? What would be the advantage of calculating the beginning of a new day at sunset? Who's got an idea?
Maybe the evening because we rest. So we begin our day with a rest, something like that.
Yeah, I'm with you. Our modern understanding of beginning a day at midnight, of course, would make no sense to an ancient person. How are you supposed to know when midnight is, right? If you get up in the middle of the night to use the restroom or get a glass of water, you don't know what time it is unless you hit your alarm clock and get that number to glow a little bit, right? That's a very modern experience, which is completely dependent on electricity and electronic forms of timekeeping. That's very distant from the experience of an ancient person. The ancient person is going to keep time with the sun, of course. There's no other way to do that. And you've got two options. You have two major events in your solar day, which you could use to keep time, to begin a day and close a day. Those two events are obviously sunrise and sunset. The ancient astronomers tell me that the reason why the ancient peoples, Babylonians, also the Jews, reckoned the beginning of the day as beginning at sunset is because the new moon is first visible immediately after sunset. I didn't know that, but apparently every new moon becomes visible for the first time approximately 15 minutes after sunset. That was a new piece of historical or astronomical information for me. And that, to most historians of astronomy, is the real reason why ancient peoples began the day at evening, because your new moon rises. And so your new month is proclaimed right after sunset. But I think I could add to that the psychological reason that, if the point of timekeeping is to synchronize your human society, more people are aware of your sunsets than your sunrises. I at least have seen a whole lot more sunsets in my life than sunrises, and I wonder if that's a contributing psychological reason to why ancient communities began the day at sunset. Now, my third reason here to make sense of the day beginning at sunset is you've got to remember that ancient people in the Middle East also probably had a siesta. right? So if you have a pause in the middle of the day where you might retreat or stop work or possibly even take a nap, then it makes a little more sense to fire up your day, to begin your day at sunset. I have never lived in a society that's kept full siestas. I once spent a summer in France, and I was surprised to learn in France that the grocery stores are closed between, at least they were in 2003, they are closed between 12 in the afternoon, between noon and 2 p.m. I believe that's still largely the case. Southern France, when I was there, celebrated sort of a half siesta. But in cultures like probably like ancient Israel, where there was a full siesta, where people were not working in the middle of the day, starting the day at sunset, excuse me, would make a lot of sense. The last piece that we have to understand concerning how the Jews reckon time is that they counted partial days when counting time in terms of days. So we have, for example, and that's in the Mishnah, we can go through that, but there's a specific instruction. Helpfully the rabbis give us specific instructions contemporaneous with Jesus that days are to be reckoned according to partial days. So Josephus, for example, writing in the 1st century, when he means to say exactly 1 week from now, he will say in 8 days, because, and count it on your fingers if you need to. I did before the presentation to get it right. If you're counting partial days, and today is Thursday, and I want to say Thursday again this time from today, I'm gonna say 8 days from now, even if it's just seven 24-hour periods from now. Okay, so in antiquity, they counted time a bit differently than we do. Now we're ready to try to understand how Are you all with me? Is everybody okay? I know we're moving through a lot of information. I see some heads shaking and some heads not shaking. Okay. Now we're ready to understand how Passover worked. And then we're ready to understand how the Gospels put all these things together. Okay, how was Passover celebrated in Jesus' day? Well, the second handout that I've given you on the same principle, this is a study sheet. You can do self-study. I've tried to be completely transparent in the explanations that I give you. But this sheet will help us to understand how the Passover worked, what the instructions are in the Old Testament concerning how to celebrate Passover. Now, this calendar looks a bit different. First of all, we're counting out evening to sunset, right? I don't have midnight to midnight. I'm trying to place this, I'm trying to reflect the biblical understanding of how these holidays are supposed to be played out. So the days begin at evening and end at sunset, okay? And then also we're using the lunar month names for the days. We don't have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday up here. We have Nisan the 13th, Nisan the 14th, and so on. Okay, so this is meant to reflect the biblical understanding of how these holidays are celebrated. Now, also, what we need to understand is that Passover is part of a celebration of 3 feasts. Okay, and we can see them here. Passover is celebrated, that is to say, the Passover lamb is sacrificed on Nisan the 14th on the afternoon, immediately prior to sunset. That's Passover, and the Passover meal then is celebrated on the evening of Nisan the 15th. You see how that works. That's the Passover. There's 2 other festivals that are interlocking with the celebration of the Passover. We also have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. What is that? The Feast of Unleavened Bread is a week-long period. The first day, that's Nisan the 15th, and the 7th day, that's Nisan the 21st, are holy convocations. That means they're true holidays. There's no work done on the first day and the 7th day, Nisan the 15th and the 21st. And in between, the celebrants are not to eat any yeast or leaven. Okay, so that's the second festival. We've got Passover, and Passover, in fact, the Passover meal is the first moment of this week-long Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, there's a third holiday that's interlocking with these other two, and that is called first fruits. Okay, first fruits on the year that Jesus died was celebrated on Nisan the 16th, but let's go down to the footnote here. Okay, the Feast of First Fruits, or simply First Fruits, is described in Leviticus 23, 9 to 14. Okay, we read in Leviticus 23:11 that the priest was to wave the sheaf as a wave offering on the day after the Sabbath. First fruits was therefore to be celebrated on the day after Sabbath following the Passover. Now, because the 7 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, though that cycle of days is independent from the month, the day of the lunar month, that means that Passover could be celebrated on any day of the week. Passover could be celebrated on a Monday, could be celebrated on a Tuesday, and so on. The formula for determining first fruits, according to Leviticus 23, is that first fruits is to be celebrated on the Sabbath. That's a day of the week, not a day of the month, after Passover. So that means that first fruits could be celebrated at any point during this week-long Feast of Unleavened Bread. However, on the year that Jesus died and was raised again, first fruits was celebrated on Nisan 16th. How do we know that? Because we know that Jesus died on Nisan the 14th, and we know that Nisan the 15th was a Sabbath, because in the Gospels we read that the women are resting on the day after Jesus' crucifixion. So on the year of Jesus' death, we know that first fruits was celebrated on Nisan the 16th, or a Sunday. Now that's quite interesting, because Paul seems to affirm this tradition here when let's see. Yes, when he writes in 1 Corinthians 15:20, but now Christ has been raised from the dead as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The imagery there is really beautiful. First fruits, and Paul explores that, right? Just as Jesus was raised from the dead on this celebration of first fruits, the symbolic meaning of first fruits is the giving up to God of the first of the harvest. And Christ is the first of that new life, that first of the harvested new abundant life that God gives to his people. Okay, I want you to notice that before we move to. But here's what's happening with the celebration of the Passover. I also want to note very quickly, Nisan the 14th in the Gospels is called the Day of Preparation. You might have encountered that name in the Gospels. There are the references in which where we have that phrase. You might have been asking, what is this Day of Preparation that the evangelists are talking about? The texts here from the Pentateuch, and I've listed them all out here for you, again, hopefully to make self-study as rewarding as possible. And also, I needed the worksheets so that I could come to the conclusions that I did. But in the Pentateuch, you won't read of the phrase preparation. That word preparation there is used by the Gospels, but not the Pentateuch, to refer to Nisan the 14th. And you can see that it makes sense. This is the day of getting ready for the Passover. This is the day when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, getting ready for the next day, which is supposed to be a holy convocation. No work is supposed to be done on that day. So all the work for Passover is meant to take place on the day before. Okay, we're ready to dive in and put this all together. I've worked you very, very hard. Do you have any questions before we dive into the seeing how this plays out in the Gospels? I'm sorry, this is a technical, gang. I wish I could make it simpler, and maybe next round I will be able to make it simpler. But at the moment, this is the simplest I can make the machine run at. Any questions? Clarifying questions, perhaps?
Dr. Armstrong, Jason
Yes.
here, maybe just to put in the chat there. So if I understood right, 2 Sabbaths then during Passover week, the normal Sabbath, then the high Sabbath, or like it says in Leviticus.
Right. Let's look at that. I remember, you're going to have to jog my memory, Brother Jason. I remember John, the Gospel of John, talking about a high Sabbath. Was there high Sabbath here in, do you have the reference on you? Here's my,
No, I just
here's my,
remember I think it's in 23, Leviticus 23, maybe.
okay. I do not have the word high in this handout. Here's my memory, Jason, and you can correct me if I've got this wrong. What I remember is that John talks about a high Sabbath. We can take the time to locate that exact passage, or one of you can do that for us in a moment. And when he says high Sabbath, I assume what he means is uh, when the time when the Passover would fall, the time when the Sabbath would fall immediately after the Passover. At least that's the situation that is described in the Gospels. But I don't recall that phrase being in the Pentateuch. I just remember John saying that day was a high Sabbath, referring to the Sabbath after the celebration of the Passover. Oh, Jason, I'm sorry. Can I clarify that? I think I do remember what's going on here. Here's what's going on. I'm so sorry. I clutched. Please scrap that last explanation. Here's what's happening. John is telling us, and somebody fetch that reference for us, that'd be super helpful. John is telling us that on the year of Jesus' crucifixion, we have Nisan the 14th, the day that Jesus is crucified, on the afternoon of the 14th. And Nisan the 15th is that high holy day that John talks about. This is the day of the celebration of the Passover meal.
Right. Got it. Yep.
There's a little confusion there that our English word Passover can mean either the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, which took place on the afternoon of the 14th, and it can mean the celebration of the dinner, which took place on the first part of the 15th. But there, that Sabbath being a high Sabbath means that Saturday concurred with Passover.
Yeah, good.
Cool. Thank you so much.
It says in 1931, since it was the day of preparation, so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. For that Sabbath was a high day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might not be broken. So I think that's the text there in John.
Thank you so much. I'll get that in my notes for next time.
Great. Yeah.
Let's see how this theory plays out. And again, I'm super excited that I think it all does fit together. Here's when we move the Passover, the celebration of the Passover, to the Wednesday afternoon, suddenly these accounts, these Passion Week accounts, snap together like puzzle pieces. And that just gives me huge joy. Here's the first place that we can see this theory bringing fruitfulness in our attempts to understand the texts here. Just for time's sake, I'll read these, but we have two synoptic accounts, Mark 14, 1-2, and Matthew 26, 1-5, where Jesus says that it is 2 days before Passover, and then he celebrates the dinner with Mary and Martha and is anointed. The anointing then takes place 2 days before Passover. That's what we read in Matthew and Mark. But in John, we have 6 days before the Passover. What's going on here? I'm going to read just Mark, and then Matthew is a somewhat expanded version of Mark here at this point. So I'm just going to read Mark and John for time's sake. But here's what we read in Mark 14, 1-2. Now it was 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, just because we've gone through that, you can see how the Feast of what Mark is talking about too. The Passover, oh yes, and that begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Here we're talking about the same moment. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him, for they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. Now, John, telling the same story in his gospel, says 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Now, we're going to be boxed in, except watch this work, everybody. I just find this so fascinating. Watch this. Here we are back to our Passion Week calendar. And here's, you can count it out. I've done it in the footnotes too. John 12:1 says that Jesus came to Bethany 6 days before the Passover. Count it out, it works. Day 1, if we're counting partial days, as we know the Jews did, day 1 is this area here. We would call that Monday afternoon. Day 2 is sunset here through till this afternoon. We'd call that Tuesday. Day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. And on day 6, the Pharisees are celebrating the Passover. Right. Great. The synoptic accounts are correct here too. The synoptic accounts say that Jesus came to Bethany. Actually, the wording there is different. They say that Jesus was at the dinner. So I've counted Jesus arriving in the afternoon. You count 2 days beginning at the supper. You can look at footnote 18 if you want all the details. There you go. I've got a long footnote. Matthew and Mark calculate the 2 days prior to Passover to be the time from the anointing at Bethany, Monday at sunset until the Last Supper, Wednesday at sunset. That's day 1. Monday through sunset through Tuesday afternoon. That's day 1. Day 2, Tuesday sunset through Wednesday afternoon. Then Passover, sunset on Wednesday. The synoptic accounts are correct here too. Mark says it's 2 days. The dinner at Bethany is 2 days before Passover. Let's count it out. 1, 2, that's 2 days before Jesus celebrates the Last Supper with his disciples. Yoo-hoo! Yeah, it works, guys. I'm excited about that. That's evidence 1. Now, I've got 5 more arguments or lines of evidence to conclude that this theory is correct. The second line of evidence is that Jesus could not have been crucified on the afternoon following the Passover meal. Now, because this is a historical conclusion, maybe we should say it's extremely improbable, but I think it's extreme. I think it's a theory hardly worth considering that Jesus could have been crucified on Passover day. If you read through the Pentateuch, this is the Holy Convocation. No work is going to be done. There's no possible way you could have gotten the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas and Antipas to leave the celebration of the Passover and to go hold a trial and then to have Jesus condemned to death. There's no possible way you could get a group of 70 Orthodox Jews to break with their Sabbath celebration. And in fact, the text tells us that this was their direct strategy. The texts say, for they said, that's the religious leaders, not during the feast. That is to say, not beginning on the first day of the celebration of Passover, lest there be an uproar from the people. Matthew reaffirms that too, but they said not during the feast, lest there be an uproar of the people. So again, just put that on the sheet so that it's perfectly clear for us. What are the Gospels saying? The religious leaders there in those texts are saying you can't have Jesus crucified on this day, sunset of Friday or Saturday. But if we were to say, which we don't, but if we were to say that the Last Supper is this Friday, and that Jesus was, well, okay, let's push it back. If we were to say that the Passover fell on a Thursday, which is, by the way, still the traditional interpretation. So if you push the Passover back to here and say that Jesus celebrated the Last Supper as Passover on Thursday, then you have Jesus celebrating Passover here. This is the night of his trial. Well, then you're going to get a timeline that is so condensed, it's not going to work. So that when the Pharisees are saying not to have Jesus crucified on the Passover, they're saying not on Nisan the 15th. Good, I hope that's clear. We'll continue to move through the arguments and try to make that as clear as possible. Line of evidence 3. The traditional rendering of the Passion Week doesn't know what to do of Wednesday. So here I'm using a calendar from a German language ministry. I happen to have this, and the last time I gave the presentation, I'm going to give you an English calendar in just a minute, but this was actually the best calendar that I could find. And on Wednesday, it says the still day, rest day, possibly the preparation day for the Passover. It's a fine ministry, Gladium Spiritus. It's a fine ministry. I have absolutely nothing against them. They do great work in putting together visual representations of Bible teaching. They do great stuff. But I just cite this to show you that the traditional reading of Passover week doesn't know what to do with Wednesday. That's been a long-standing problem. Here's an English ministry, Christianity.com, that also does fine biblical scholarship. Love what they do. But look what they say on Wednesday. Wednesday, no record in the Gospels. Okay, what do you mean no record in the Gospels? Yes, the traditional accounting leaves Wednesday as empty because I'll just show you one more time very briefly. If you say that Jesus died here on Thursday, then you've created two problems for yourself. The first problem is that Wednesday becomes empty, and that's the problem we're discussing now, but it also creates a secondary problem for you in that it condenses the chronology of Jesus' trial so tightly, it really becomes impossible. So we create two historical problems for ourselves by placing the Last Supper on Thursday instead of on a Wednesday. Let's get to that problem. Here's the other problem we create for ourselves by placing the Last Supper on a Thursday, and that is that there's just not enough time for all the events mentioned in the Gospels concerning Jesus' trial to take place between Thursday night and Friday morning. It just becomes really impossible. So what do we got to do? According to the biblical account, what do we have to do for all of these events to take place in that amount of time? Well, we've got to get the Passover lamb roasted. Josephus tells us that the lambs were slain, thousands, tens of thousands of lambs were slain in the temple courts between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. on Nisan the 14th. Now, I won't take the time to do it. The sheet there is for you, but if you look over the Passover sheet and study out the Pentateuch passages which talk about the Passover and the slaying of the Passover lamb, that's supposed to take place right at sunset. Okay, there's clear instructions that's to take place at sunset. Now, sunset is, I won't go into all the details, but it seems that Jesus was crucified on April the 24th of the year 30 AD. That seems highly likely from the reconstructions that I've walked through. April the 24th, the sun sets about 7 p.m. in Jerusalem. So if you get your Passover lamb in a slain form, but now we need to go home and dress it and cook it. How long is that going to take place? Well, I put these times here. I've given the timestamps to make the chronology work, but it becomes insane. There's just no possible way you can make all of these things happen that the Gospels record in the context of a single day. Here's what would have to happen, but it's impossible. You've roasted the Passover lamb and made final dinner preparations, and you start Passover by 9 p.m. Any of you ever had lamb? I went to a village in the Masai Mara once and had a goat. This was old world. They slay the goat and they cook it. Probably something like what it would be like to slay and eat a Passover lamb. You're cooking that thing for hours, right? I mean, this is going to take hours to cook this. So a 2-hour period of preparation is ridiculous, but let's try it. Celebrating the Passover meal. Remember John 13 to 17, the upper room discourse? That's a ton of teaching that Jesus delivers, including that amazing prayer, John 17. To make it work, we're going to say that all of that takes place between 9 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. We're going to give 2.5 hours for the celebration of Passover, the Seder, and this extensive teaching that Jesus gives, the foot washing, etc. Jesus and the disciples go to Gethsemane. We'll give half an hour for that. Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. We'll give 1 hour for that. That's midnight now to 1 a.m. Peter denies Jesus while Jesus is accused before Annas, Caiaphas, and the Sanhedrin. This is where the chronology becomes impossible, because the Sanhedrin was a group of 70 Jewish men, elders. There's no possible way that it was a surprise that Jesus was arrested, somewhat surprising. There's just no possible way you're going to get all 70 of them to convene at 1 in the morning promptly. but that's what would have had to have happened. And John describes there's a trial before Annas and Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. There's 3 trials effectively. But to make the chronology work, we're going to say it takes place between 1 and 3 a.m. But things are stretched to the breaking point. Jesus appears before Pilate for the first time between 3 a.m. This is also wholly impossible. There's no possible way you could get Pilate up out of bed to hold trial at 3 in the morning. That stretches the imagination. Then Jesus appears before Herod. We'll give that 5 to 7 a.m. Then Jesus appears before Pilate for a second time and sentenced to crucifixion. Mark tells us that that trial takes place at 9 a.m. Though that's what needs to happen. And I think that's stretched to the breaking point. Now, what our alternative theory does really nicely, and the Dominican archaeologist Bargil Pixner does really nicely at this point, says that there's another day in there. Wednesday, according to tradition, was empty. Well, that's actually the day of the Last Supper. And then what's taking place on Thursday, we already begin the trial. So Peter betrays Jesus. And what's, of course, the sign? That's cock crow. Of course, a crow can cry at any time of day, but presumably that scene ends in the very early morning. The cock is crowing repeatedly, right? So let's push that into the early morning of Thursday. And then you don't get a Roman governor out of bed at 3 in the morning. That's just not going to happen. So, but maybe at 6 or 7 or 8, you could have the first trial before Pilate. Now, Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. He's also in Jerusalem. It's not a long distance travel, but there's some arrangements that would need to take place in sending Jesus to Herod. And they're not on good terms. Remember, Luke tells us that they're friends after this event, but not prior to this. They're not texting each other a lot. So we're going to give a few hours. We're going to say this takes a couple hours. Then, now very interestingly, what this does then is that Jesus probably spent the first night in a prison somewhere. Now, that's not recorded in the biblical texts. The Gospels do not give us an indication that that took place. Pixnar suggests that Jesus would have been held in I forget which prison he identified as the likely candidate, but Jesus would have been held in a prison overnight. Jesus' second trial before Pilate, and that begins to explain too why in the Gospels Jesus effectively has 2 trials, on Thursday morning and on Friday morning. And Mark tells us that second trial takes place at 9 in the morning. Now we're making sense, or that chronology begins to fit into place, and then we have adequate time for the events described in the Gospels. Why? There's one residual question. If the trial of Jesus took place over a 2-day period, modern reckoning of time, why don't the Gospels tell us that explicitly? You can argue that in Matthew and Mark, the way that the trial of Herod is structured, it does appear like there's 2 trials next to each other. You can argue that the text does more or less clue us into that. But I think we also have to make the plea that the apostles were not with Jesus during the trial. Apparently, they all fled. And so the apostles' reconstruction of that trial does look not as detailed as I guess we would want it to be, or as we could wish to get all the historical information perfectly clear in our minds. Now, here's another detail. I'm almost done. Almost done. Hold with me for another couple minutes. The other reason why it makes a lot of sense to say that Jesus' trial took place over 2 days is, in fact, the Mishnah says that for a capital case, that is in a case where a person will be sentenced to death, it was necessary for the trial to take place over 2 days. Here's what Mishnah Sanhedrin 4 says: in cases of a capital law, that is to say, in a court case where the outcome might be a person being sentenced to death, the court brings the accused back to be judged again with a claim to acquit him. But in cases of capital law, the court brings the accused back to be judged again with a claim to acquit him, but the court does not bring him back to be judged with a claim to find him liable. In cases of capital law, the text continues, the court judges during the daytime and concludes the deliberations and issues the ruling only in the daytime. Therefore, since capital cases might continue for 2 days, the court does not judge cases of capital law on certain days, neither on the eve of Sabbath nor the eve of a festival. Now, this is recorded a little bit later than Jesus. It probably dates to the 2nd century. So it's not 100% that this law was in place and in effect during the trial of Jesus. But it's highly likely that this tradition was upheld. It's a few decades later. And if it were, then we have certainty that that Jesus trial must have taken place over 2 days. Here, the Mishnah states that in a capital case where a man's life is on trial, you do not judge during the nighttime, but only in the daytime. Well, some of this then therefore could not have taken place in the middle of the night. And they say, if the court rules against someone in a capital case, if someone is tentatively sentenced to death, the court must come together again the next day. All right. So that seems to be a strong indication then that Jesus' trial must have taken place over 2 days, as the Mishnah here states. Here's another little bit of evidence that the trial took place over 2 days. It's not an airtight argument, but I think worth mentioning. And that is that the wife of Pilate had apparently already heard about Jesus' trial. Remember in Matthew 27:17-19, we read this. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now, it is possible that God inspired the dream such that Pilate's wife, with no prior context, could have sent a message to Pilate and said, whatever you do, whoever it is that you're trying right now, don't condemn him to death. That is possible. God can do that. But I think what is happening here is that the dream that God gave to Pilate's wife probably had the context of a dinner conversation between Pilate and herself as well. So here's the way I imagine the scene playing out. Pilate comes home that night, the night of the first trial, and says, "Honey, I had a terrible day." "Yeah, why?" "Well, Jesus of Nazareth was on trial today. He doesn't look guilty to me. I think he's being set up." And they discussed it. Okay. God inspires in Pilate's wife that night a frightening dream, which convinces her that Jesus is innocent. And she sends word back to Pilate the next morning, which would be the morning of the second trial. Now, it's possible that there was no prior context, that Pilate and his wife had no conversation about Jesus because none of the trial had taken place up to that point. That is, I suppose, possible, but I think it's a slight evidence that this trial had taken place over 2 days. My last bit of evidence for you is that there is circumstantial evidence that Jesus may have celebrated the Passover with the Essenes and according then to an alternate calendar. This is just a few scraps of circumstantial evidence, but I'll give to you because I think it belongs here. The first question is, why are the preparations for the Last Supper as described in the Gospels apparently secretive? Okay, my presumption there is that Jesus is celebrating the Passover according to an alternate calendar, and so he doesn't want to broadcast or tell the whole world that he's doing this. It's going to be a private celebration. And if Jesus were celebrating the Passover according to a minority calendar in the Essene community, then maybe he would have been a little bit more cautious on and a little bit more secretive in setting up the details. When we read the account, and for time's sake I won't, but it does seem the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all seem to share the understanding that there's a secret prearrangement. Jesus has set this up quietly, that the disciples would celebrate the Last Supper together. Why the secrecy? Perhaps because they're celebrating according to an alternate calendar. Now, this is a detail that I didn't notice, but many scholars who've looked at this passage have inform us of this. Why was a man carrying water? That doesn't strike me at all odd, but many scholars will point out that carrying water was not man's work in Jesus' day. So the fact that a man is carrying water is very conspicuous. Here's the theory. The Essenes were celibate, and so the men of the Essene community carried water. Maybe the very fact that this is a man carrying water is circumstantial evidence that this is an Essene, and that they're going to celebrate in the Essene community. Pixnar, the archaeologist, spent the quarter century digging in the old city of Jerusalem and is specifically working in the Essene community. He is convinced that Jesus had some sort of connection with the Essene community. The traditional site for the Last Supper is not in that Essene part, but very near. The Essene community was just outside of the Zion Gate. Pixnar is convinced that Jesus had ties to the Essene community of some variety. Here's another clue. John repeatedly refers to the Passover as the Passover of the Jews. That doesn't really make sense unless John is dividing between the Passover of the Jews, as celebrated according to the Jewish calendar, and Jesus' own celebration of the Last Supper. Why would you say the Passover of the Jews? Only the Jews celebrate the Passover. That doesn't make any sense. Or John says in John 19:42, the preparation day of the Jews. That's very puzzling, unless we understand that John is specifically saying the Passover as celebrated according to the Jewish calendar, knowing that Jesus celebrated according to an alternate calendar. All right, everybody, you've been fantastically patient with me. I'm excited about this again because it's resolved for me what was one of the hardest nuts to crack. This was the hardest piece of historical difficulty in the resurrection accounts. And I'm just thrilled that I think thanks to Annie Joubert and Joseph Ratzinger and a whole team of other scholars, we can actually resolve what has been a very difficult problem in New Testament scholarship. It gives me great confidence when the Gospels get this part of the story right. They also got the part about Jesus rising from the dead right. Hope you have a wonderful celebration of Easter.